All right, good morning. I'm going to assume we're on. Um, I think we're on. I'm going to assume we're on. Good morning, everyone. I'm Melanie Weiss. I'm the Managing Director here at Varian, and welcome to our public webinar, Insights on Tobacco, Understanding Behavioural Drivers and Emerging Trends in reducing Australia's smoking prevalence. As I said, my name is Melanie. I'm the Managing Director here at Varian, and I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the beautiful country we're meeting on today, and acknowledge elders past, present, and emerging. We are delighted to have you with us. We welcome your questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we will be able to see your questions and hopefully leave enough time our conversation perfectly to be able to answer them and not have too much awkward space at the back. As one of Australia's leading public sector advisory businesses, over the last 4 years, Varian has conducted thousands of hours of discussions and surveyed more than 10,000 smokers, vapers, dual users, quizzes, and at-risk youth, illicit tobacco users, retailers, and influencers of people who use nicotine products and members of the wider Australian community on this topic. Over time, this work has given us a real opportunity to observe Australia's nicotine landscape at a time of significant disruption and change and build up a significant body of audience-led research around behaviours, attitudes and interventions. So we have some insights we think that are absolutely worth sharing. We're also very conscious that we don't have all the evidence here. Much of the long-term epidemiological evidence and public health evidence sits with Australia's leading health agencies, researchers and peak bodies. And that is why I am delighted today to be able to be joined by two exceptionally experienced experts who've accepted our invitation, as well as our own expert. I'd like to introduce Laura Hunter first. Laura is the CEO of the Australian Council on Smoking and Health. Laura is Chief Executive and leads the national advocacy effort to reduce smoking and vaping and protect future generations from tobacco-related harm. Is that right, Laura? Excellent. With a career spanning public health research, health promotion, government engagement, and policy development, Laura brings deep understanding of how evidence can be translated into public health action. Before joining ACOSH, she had roles with the Cancer Council in Western Australia, Healthway, and Curtin University. Laura is a passionate advocate for stronger tobacco and vaping control measures and is a respected voice in shaping Australia's public health response to the issues, and I think joins us from Canberra today. Is that right?
I sure
Lovely.
am. Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. It's
Yeah,
great to be
pleasure.
on.
Uh, Next is Nick Connolly. Nick is the head of the Federal Health Department's Market Research Unit. Nick has a career spanning 30 years working in Australia and the UK in a range of sectors with a focus on informing behaviour change and public sentiment. This has included roles in road safety, disability, and the Office of Film and Literature Classification. Dad, glad you've had a little stint in something a bit lighter there, Nick. Um, since
It has its
2000,
light moments, that one.
Since 2007, Nick has been in the Australian Government Department of Health, Disability and Ageing's Market Research Unit. Nick has a background in psychology and economics, and his current role, he leads the research program that informs the public health campaigns spanning the breadth of the health portfolio. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
And Craig Donovan, our very own Craig Donovan, Director of Federal Business here in Australia. Craig leads our federal government business where he leads research, evaluation and advisory work for those clients. Craig has exceptionally deep expertise in behaviour change, public policy and evidence-based decision making. He's helped organisations tackle some of Australia's most complex health and social change issues. His work focuses on understanding how people think, feel and behave, sometimes before they know themselves, and translating those insights into practical strategies that improve policy and program outcomes. Today, Craig will focus on how research can help support more effective responses to tobacco and vaping behaviours and help shape future public policy approaches. Welcome, Craig. So today
Thank
we're going to
you.
have a discussion about how the nicotine landscape is changing, how behaviour is changing within it, and what that means for public health, social marketing, policy, and research. Specifically, today we'll explore the current state of play and emerging trends, what we've learned in some of our thousands of hours with Australians about smoking, vaping, and nicotine use, How cultural and behavioural issues, or the forces of choice, I guess, are forcing broader disruption across the uptake and cessation landscape. And finally, what all this might mean for future public policy, for communications and intervention strategies, and what the bright spots are that we see on the horizon. So first to the current state of play, a combination of historic reforms from tobacco and advertising, restrictions on tobacco advertising through to graphic health warnings, taxation measures, plain packaging, has constantly placed Australia, proudly I think, at the forefront of tobacco control. Until relatively recently, that combination of regulation, taxation and legislation and communication was producing a clear long-term trend, and each successive generation was consistently smoking less than the one that came before it, which is not to suggest it was a golden age of tobacco control or that it was easy. Smoking prevalence was far higher than it was today, and historically smoking was much more visible and socially accepted. Coming from, I remember watching Mad Men in the early noughties and just being horrified at how much smoking was integrated into day-to-day life and how far we've come, delighted with how far we've come. And there were significantly fewer restrictions on where and when smoking could occur. The challenge today is obviously very different. As a consequence, many of the assumptions that have underpinned tobacco control for decades are being tested in new ways. So, Nick, I'll start with you. From your perspective, what are the most significant shifts you've observed in the nicotine landscape over the last, let's say, decade, in terms of prevalence trends and changes in products' behaviour and intervention strategies? Maybe you can give us a bit of a 10,000 foot view.
A 10,000 foot view, that's a good way of putting it. I mean, I think my 10,000 foot view is there's been some great changes and there's a lot to be optimistic about. I mean, the latest household survey data is I'm sure everyone on the call is aware of where we're at in terms of the targets and smoking rates. They have gone down again, which is great. But I think I'd temper that with just, the complexity of the landscape and the marketplace has just increased tenfold in that last 10 years. I think just the range of products that are available, the way people are approaching the market, the ability for people to access marketplaces and different markets has really shifted. And we're just seeing that complexity in terms of behaviours and the range of behaviours that we're confronting is the wrong word, but are observing in the marketplace, particularly amongst those younger audiences. We don't see a smoking landscape anymore. I think we're seeing a nicotine landscape. And I think that is a real shift for us that has meant that we really need to reconvene and reconfigure the way we approach this sort of nicotine landscape. So
yeah, we're fighting multiple fires on multiple fronts instead of just one.
Exactly. I mean, I won't harp on all the rates and the achievements that we've done because everybody knows them, I think. And I think if you look at that sort of that really longer term thing, I think young people in particular, if you looked at 2001, the rates of smoking, I think were at somewhere around 30%. And now we're down at that under 10 in that really low sort of levels, which is really, to me, that's an amazing achievement. But I think we're at this nexus point where we've got a whole lot of other things that we didn't anticipate necessarily 10 or 15 years ago that are really working to create that complexity. So yeah, it's an interesting space to be in at the moment.
Laura, in your time in this field, what changes have you seen in the public health system and how it's adapting to that changing landscape? Because I guess as it gets more complex, our responses need to change as well.
I think we are very adaptive. And I think, like Nick said, I am ever the optimist. We have made huge progress on reducing smoking in Australia, and we do still continue to see those successes and those wins. But we are seeing, that progress being tested by that commercial, like that accessible and confusing nicotine environment. I think the mistake would be to treat this simply as a question of whether people know the risks to this. Most people do have a bit of an awareness now. There's been movement and that dial moving quite a bit, but addiction, and I think Craig will talk to this as well, but that social belonging, the availability the price and the product marketing as well that we can see on social media, those can very easily outweigh that knowledge in that moment. And so from a public health perspective, we can't leave individuals, particularly children and young people, to navigate that really highly engineered nicotine landscape on their own. We can't do that. And the job of policy is to really make sure that the healthier choice, which is in this case fresh air into your lungs, and that addictive product, we need to make sure it's less available and less appealing and less normalized, because at the moment across the country you have $8 packets of cigarettes on most street corners, and in those retailers selling those illegal packets of cigarettes there's often illicit vapes being sold as well. It's an incredibly complex environment, and one that there's a lot of work to do in.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Laura. So it's in fact not just a public health response. It's a bigger than just health, right?
It's big. It's very big. Yeah, much bigger than health.
Craig, I might turn to you as the head researcher on some of the data that we've been producing over the last few years. How are these changes showing up for citizens, I guess, or nicotine users and those that live and work with them? And how has that changed in the last little bit?
Yeah, so I think the biggest thing, and Nick and Laura have kind of touched on this in their opening remarks, is those choice factors. So historically, tobacco cessation was kind of set up to address a kind of a binary choice. So the issue was, do we smoke or do we not? And again, as you were saying, Mel, no one's trying to suggest there was a golden age when this was easy, but certainly the need to attack kind of only one product, one clear product in the category has kind of been the history. So our work over the last 3-4 years probably coincided with kind of the peak of what we hope is a peak and now a decline in youth vaping. But certainly in late 2023, when we first started working with federal health and then later some other federal departments to look at illicits and other issues, I think, it's the whole choice architecture, right? So Laura may make this point, but there's the absolute availability. So young people and smokers who might see vapes and think they're a better choice. So there are those literal pragmatic problems of where the products are sold, how visible they are, how cheaply they're priced. But there's also kind of a psychological factor as well. So I think one of the most profound things that we've seen is the way in which the perceptions of choice actually kind of distort and mask health risk, and particularly the way that vaping has become kind of the dominant anchor through which all kind of choices and assessment of risk is actually made.
When you say choices augmenting risk, what do you mean, Craig?
So the historical choice for a young person would have been smoke or not to smoke. They can now look at, well, I could smoke, but what does that mean for myself, my self-identity? What does that mean for long-term risk, immediate risk, social risk, for example? They can then look at things like a vape. They experience vaping differently. It turns up, it shows up differently. So their assessment of risks and their beliefs distorts again. And then we have kind of a further wild card now with an emergent layer of new nicotine products that are being kind of aggressively marketed and available. So, strong penetration, or we're starting to see signs of, kind of then becoming a further parallel option. Gums, nicotine, toothpicks, pouches, zins, that kind of thing. So then, you're confronted with combustible tobacco, a kind of flavored, vaporized form, and then a product that has none of those features, but like in a pouch can deliver nicotine directly to you. So it's the presence of those choices is profoundly distorting in terms of then what people believe, how they're able to take on health messages. And what happens is the kind of the category of risk gets traded off internally. So the question now is,
So there are more choices
which
I'm
of
making than healthy or not healthy. I'm making choices
within
category.
category, yeah, absolutely.
And Nick, how is that kind of factoring into how we communicate and who we communicate with?
Yeah, it's really influencing, and it's really we're now having multiple message frames, we're having multiple streams, and we're having a real diversity of target audiences in terms of our communications. I think going back to your original question as well, that how we communicate has really had to change in terms of the social media landscape, the diversity of ways that people are seeking information and how they're getting that information and consuming it. So for us, the messaging, I guess, we really have to be much more nuanced and tailored in our messaging, not just that traditional smoking message, but much more around that choice landscape that Craig was talking about, and making sure that we frame those risks relative to making them proximate to the target audiences that we're really looking at. So young people's a classic example in terms of the smoking and vaping space. When we talk to them about that, those various things, there's this real tension around how they're placing, which Craig was referring to, how they're placing the relative risks around the various behaviours that they might want to engage in, and making sure that we understand when we're communicating what will be proximate to them and really motivate them in the here and now, rather than maybe in 20 years when they might be facing cancer or things like that. So we're having to shift that real piece of communication and the focus of our communications to match where our audiences are at. Where we might have had just one sort of key message previously. Now we've got 5, 6, many more streams just coming at different elements of our target audiences. So it's a much more complex landscape. But the media landscape also lets us play in that a lot more in terms of the ability to target through different channels and stuff. So it swings and roundabouts in terms of how complex that is.
Yeah, so we've got to stay on top of it, but those tools that I guess are getting to young people are available to us too if we use them well.
They are, yeah. I mean, government voice is a difficult thing, and we'll probably touch on that a bit later. But yeah, we can reach them. It's a matter of reaching them with an effective message is the real challenge at the moment.
So obviously there are lots of kind of levers available to government. Communications is one of them. Laura, beyond communications, where do you want to see the sector or the anti-tobacco sector, I guess, focusing in order to kind of meet this diversified risk and the social landscape that's evolving?
That's a really good question. I think probably feeding into what Craig and Nick have also said, it's really about, from our perspective, the availability of tobacco in Australia at the moment. So we've done some advocacy work around this and talked about kind of comparing it as well. So you have approximately 40,000 legal retailers where you can walk in and purchase a packet of cigarettes at the moment in Australia.
Yeah.
Compare that to 7,000 petrol stations, to 9,000 supermarkets. Like, this is a highly toxic, addictive, deadly product that is more available than bread and milk. And I suppose that, from my perspective, sends a really strong message to people as well. I mean, the illicit trade is so significant at the moment, and it's undermining, it has the potential to undermine a lot of our really successful policies in this country. However, my key focus at the moment is, what worries me the most is that availability. The affordability of illicit tobacco is such a huge concern as well, and we've got to address that illicit tobacco. And from a public health perspective, there is this idea that from health NGOs need to stick to health messaging and need to think about health ramifications of tobacco. I think we do also need to talk about the threats to the successes that we've seen in this country. So public health advocates stepping out and talking about the need to crack down with stronger enforcement measures across the country. It's really, really important that there is a chorus of voices talking about that. And I would love to see that 40,000 number come down substantially, obviously. And I would love to see it done in a very strategic way. So we're battling an illicit tobacco crisis at the moment. In New South Wales, for example, there have been incredible closure orders and enforcement activities in New South Wales. I think the latest closure list has about 165 stores that have been shut down. 60% of those stores are legally licensed to sell tobacco. You know, the current landscape as to who we are allowing to legally sell tobacco needs to change. If we're going to get on top of this illicit trade, and if we're going to reduce that availability, given we've got 5.6% of the population smoking daily now, it's not a very good business model, is it? So we're hoping to tackle that.
Yeah, great. Laura, that obviously feeds into kind of some of what Craig was talking about, and I touched on Mad Men before. The kind of social engine, I guess, that's driving nicotine and nicotine addiction, which has always been there. Like, James Dean smoked cigarettes. It's not a new thing that the cool kids are doing it. And I guess that's changed a little bit. Craig, what are you seeing in terms of the youth space and how kind of social identity and cultural norms are driving or not? Especially in vaping, which I guess is one of the emerging spaces for young people. Oh, on mute, Craig. Classic.
Yes, classic. I had a whole pandemic to learn how to use this technology, and no, didn't happen. So I think if there's only two messages we learned today, one is kind of about the choice factors and even choices that people don't take up. And Laura was just making that point. The presence of them, the accessibility, the visibility of them distorts behavior. But yeah, the other part is really the social engine, which in some ways is in fact the problem to solve. So back in 2023, 2024, when we first started doing a lot of work with young people. In fact, I was up here in Sydney with some of my colleagues, and to Laura's point, you would walk past the dodgy vape shops. They were everywhere, but every pub was filled and overfilled with young people spilling out onto the footpaths, and they were all all of them appeared to smoke and vape, and that was kind of the dominant mindset as well when we started speaking to young people as young as 13. So.
I think you mentioned in one of
socially,
our preliminary conversations too that that kind of emergence of new social behaviours is also being supported by venues putting in beer gardens or rooftops, or we're seeing the interaction between that
encouraged.
kind of
Yeah.
supply and demand, I guess, for places
Yeah.
that young people can smoke and vape.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It really is a changed sort of landscape in terms of that opportunity to participate in the behaviour itself.
Yeah, which reinforces the social normalisation that you're talking about, Craig.
Yeah. So kids as young as 13 who were vaping would tell us, and this wasn't literally true, but they would tell us that everyone around them, so they perceived not just their own peer groups, but they could kind of look upwards as well. So, and that's a huge inversion, right? So historically, I imagine if we'd done similar work 10 years, 15 years ago, a similar age cohort of young people would have said, yes, there's smoking, but definitely not everyone's doing it, and it's not a majority behavior. So the social engine, really strong. And in fact, the degree to which it was kind of considered a social habit, vaping in particular, really helped to mask for people some of those signs of harm and addiction. And I think Nick might talk about this a bit later, but some of our key insights were really we had to attack kind of the social layer of the problem first. So it wasn't a health decision. Health was not foregrounded for young people. They got into the habit for social reasons. And we had to find a pathway out, which was not as simple as saying a vape is the same thing as a cigarette. So socially, how it was positioned in their world, it simply wasn't. So sounds a bit counterintuitive, but for young people, attacking the social layers first before we could introduce kind of health harms turned out to be the prevailing kind of intervention logic for comms.
And I guess the health message isn't necessarily new news either, right, Nick?
Well, it depends on the space, I guess. For smoking, it's not new news. I mean, the awareness of health messages amongst all age groups is through the roof. Everybody knows the potential risks and the potential harms. In terms of vaping, I think that's a much more emerging landscape, and you know, as Craig in our research will tell you, there becomes a tension between the relative risks that people see in terms of vaping versus smoking, those really well-known risks versus the ones that might happen or might emerge or might have an impact, really does weigh into how people make those decisions. I think going back to the social aspects, though, one of the things that I've observed in sort of way too long of doing this is that those social trends, they change and they churn really quickly now. So, and I think we've seen that in the vaping space a little bit. What was once not that long ago was you know, a real social driver has now become a bit more, in young people's parlance, meh. It's like it really does shift those social not the norms, but the drivers really do shift around what is seen as you know, a desirable behavior and a behavior to engage with. Goes up and down really quickly, and we're seeing that in the smoking space amongst young people as well. I think at the moment, with some, you know, influencers playing in that space that are really sort of having an impact on how that behaviour is perceived. So, yeah.
Nick, you're hopeful that the social media delay has an effect on that and how smoking and vaping is portrayed for that younger generation? Is it a factor?
Look, I am. I think that the jury's out in terms of how effective young people are at getting around those rules. They seem to be pretty good at it, but I think the more we can delay that exposure, sure, the better. It does play a role, I think, increasingly in young people's lives. I mean, our research does say that, you know, the younger you are, the more you're getting your news, your information, all of the things that are inputting into your beliefs and your attitudes, it's coming from social media. They'll tell you that they don't trust it as much, but the sheer volume of what they're consuming in those formats is just overwhelming, I think, in terms of its ability to cut through and have an impact on those attitudes and behaviours. So yes, if we can delay that exposure, I think that can only be a good thing in this space.
Okay, so we're no longer assuming that people are smoking or vaping because they don't understand the risks, and then the message has to be broader than health. The demand for illicit tobacco isn't just about the elasticity of price or rational decision making. Our data is telling us that, you know, we've got to look further afield. We're looking at social norms and perceptions, product availability, to Laura's point, cost, the kind of mechanics of addiction, personality, identity, peer networks, market forces, policy settings. Laura, what are we missing?
There is one that I thought of just to add to the list. It's currently a hell of a lot cheaper to go down the road and purchase a packet of illegal tobacco than go to your pharmacy and purchase some combination nicotine replacement therapy. That stuff is expensive. And so if campaigns are driving people to quitting therapies, those quitting therapies need to be cheaper and they need to be subsidized. So in Queensland, for example, if you pick up the phone and call Quitline and you tick a few boxes along the way, you're entitled to get a package of combination nicotine replacement therapy delivered to your house. That needs to happen across the country. You know, we need to make it easier for people to quit. This is not just a poor choice decision. It is an addictive product. And it's a wise investment to do that as well. So that's one element, maybe, Melanie, that maybe could be picked up on as well.
Yeah, nice. Craig, when I talk to my parents about smoking, which they just, as a generation that grew up with tobacco and saw the rise and fall, I guess, of kind of public smoking, they don't understand why we're not going harder on vapes. Why don't you just tell them they can't do it? Why don't you put out all the dirty smoking messages that we all had to live through as teenagers and young people? What's the kind of argument for and against, I guess, going hard on risk-based messaging for young people and vapes? And given the kind of social engine, how do we balance that perspective?
Yeah, it's a really tough one, right? Because the profound psychological anchor, and this isn't unique to young people. We also saw it in adult smokers who might have started to, they might have started to smoke as their first choice. Later in life, they've seen vaping as a quit alternative, right? And a disposable vape is definitely not a quid aid, but mentally, they can position it in that way. But I think it's very hard to make the product seem scary, and through hundreds of hours of conversations, listening to how people describe the product features is actually quite illuminating. So, what it resolves as is really a dirty cigarette, healthy vape bias. And where does the dirty cigarette come from? I think we all know that's 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of social marketing interventions, controls around where we or where a person can and can't smoke anymore. All those sorts of things. The healthy vape comes from a range of myths and misconceptions. So some people will say, oh, I heard the UK government treats them as a legitimate quid aid and therefore they're all good. But more profoundly, the product experience. So compared to a cigarette, a vape looks benign. So a disposable, obviously, that's kind of the normative behavior. If we think about a disposable vape, it's cheap, it's colorful, it's flavored in many cases. It doesn't have a harsh smell that sticks to you, all those kind of things. So friend and foe came up a fair bit. The cigarette was almost like a foe. Vaping was more like your friend and vaping would open social doors for you in a way that the cigarette might not as a young person. When all of that is kind of foregrounded for people, there isn't as much fertile soil. And in fact, we've started to see a little bit of an inversion. In fact, some work we've been doing on behalf of Nick and his department over the last couple of months is young people are now treating the long-term medical evidence of smoking as a point of reassurance. So at the moment, a young person will say, we're a guinea pig generation. We kind of don't know what vaping is going to do to us. Maybe we'll all be dead in a decade. I think that's a bit catastrophic, right? But it's kind of a common theme we hear in focus groups. Like we actually don't know. So the long-term certainty of the health harms can kind of be held up as a benefit to smoking. So yes, I know it's dangerous, but so there's really kind of perverse inversion of medical fact. So in fact, the harder you go on that, and we're starting to hear not all young people, but increasing narratives about, they're looking harder at batteries, chemicals, etc. in vapes. And they're sort of saying, well, smoking's a natural product. They're kind of skipping what happens when you burn it, but smoking is natural. Some of the social media influences, or I know we chat about it a lot, Mel. You can watch shows like The Bear or other things on streaming platforms where the old rules about how you depict smoking kind of don't apply. So in fact, in some ways, trying to demonize, it's a huge dilemma in terms of how you intervene. But if you demonize the product or the smoking category too much, we see resoundingly that you can make by making smoking look so terrifying, you can actually confirm for audiences and particularly younger people that vaping might be okay as well. So you can end up in this real dilemma. I mean, the success we've had on vaping is excellent. I think one of the worries is we don't want to kind of backlash where I don't think there's huge signs of it yet, but we don't want then smoking behaviour to be sustained amongst a youth cohort.
So, Nick, what does all that mean then for the way governments approach behavioural change? If we've got to kind of reinforce the health messages and not try to drive people to vaping instead, but we also need to kind of drive the social engine. And like, with the greatest respect, Nick, government has never been cool. So trying to position not smoking or not vaping, I guess, as a more socially acceptable choice for young people is going to be an uphill battle. What levers are at your disposal from a behavioural change standpoint?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. And, we touched on it before. It's that complexity of the landscape in terms of the messaging and things that we need to be thinking about strategically. I think particularly with young people, the approach that we're taking, because you're right, government's never going to be the cool kid in the room. I'm resigned to that.
You're at peace with that.
I've made friends with it, yeah. But look, what the strategy that we're taking, and I think Craig is touching on it there. Young people are incredibly sophisticated in how they think now. They approach science and facts and figures and things in a way that when I was young just wasn't available to us, and they have the information to explore and draw their own conclusions. So the strategy that we're looking to really, particularly in the vaping space, is to present them with some facts and some nudges that let them draw their own conclusions strategically. So, and that's what they want to do. They want to think that when we talk to them, that their decisions are their own. They want to have agency in coming to those conclusions. So for us, it's not so much about beating them over the head and saying, don't do this. It's more about inviting them to think about the behaviors that they're engaging in, and to draw them towards thinking about what the consequences of those might be, how they feel about those consequences, and how their peer groups might sort of respond to those as well, in terms of seeing them, be in some cases, sometimes, looking less good or not being as fit or healthy, or those types of things that really do in that young space have that real close proximity to making decisions. As Craig pointed out, the long-term impacts of smoking are tomorrow me's problem for a lot of young people. It's about what they're experiencing now. So it's drawing them in to be able to make those conclusions and take those steps to say, and ask themselves the questions around, do I really want to be engaging in this behavior? That's sort of where we're at in terms of, I think that young audience in particular. I think as people get older, those much more traditional smoking messages and just the blunt force quit and health impacts and stuff, there's still a role for that, absolutely. But that sophistication and that, I guess, that the narrative that we're asking people to engage in is really important in those other audiences.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. And Laura, the one player we haven't talked about in this landscape, we've talked about governments, we've talked about comms, we've talked about retailers, we've certainly talked about citizens and young people. The kind of missing player here, I guess, is industry.
Yes. So I'm in Canberra at the moment in Parliament House. The industry is not missing in this dynamic. They're well and truly here, walking the halls of Canberra. And although in Australia we don't have any concrete evidence to suggest that they're contributing to the illicit tobacco trade, we do internationally. But in Australia, despite that lack of evidence, and my biggest point is that the tobacco industry is at the epicenter of why there is an illicit tobacco trade in the first place. They, have spent decades refining their comms, refining their products to kill people, 66 Australians every day. And so I really, when I speak to politicians as well about this topic and this issue, young people are at the forefront of everything that we say, because when I speak to young people about it, in particular, there is the Tackling Indigenous Smoking teams all across the country who are, they're incredibly creative. They drive such impactful comms. And when you talk to them about the tobacco industry, they're furious. They absolutely cannot stand them. And when I even speak in the media about some of this work, we kind of say, how about stop selling these things in the first place? When are we going to get to a stage where these things are no longer a viable, product that you can go out and purchase? And the biggest, most vocal people in that space are young people. They're like, stop selling them in the first place. Now, the UK has introduced some legislation recently which introduces a tobacco-free generation. So if you're born after a certain birth date, you will never legally be allowed to be sold tobacco. And, that's definitely something that we should be considering in Australia in a big way. But that needs to come alongside a suite of measures that get us to that endpoint as well. But I think that will have some significant pushback by the industry. And essentially, I've said this a fair bit lately off the back of the Institute coming out with their survey results showing that it's 5.6% daily prevalence. there's no policy failure in this narrative whatsoever. What this shows us is that the tobacco industry knows their customer base is shrinking. Of their customers remaining, 90% are desperately trying not to be customers. And from my perspective, there's no tobacco policy failure there. There's just business model that's running out of road. And I think, from a political landscape, I think we have got ground there to say it's time to start phasing this out. I think Australia is in a really unique position to push on that at the moment.
Great, thanks, Laura. Well-timed question from the room. Thank you, anonymous attendee. Nick or Craig, has your research shown up how young people are feeling about the tobacco industry? Is there a place for our messages to focus on industry tactics rather than messages around individual behaviour? Are you seeing Laura's message reflected in the audiences that you are researching, I guess?
I don't think it's something it's not a question we've kind of actively put to the audience. And it's interesting, right? Because we often try to run research discussions in such a way that allows people to sort of organically surface things beyond which we might just put to them. So it tends not to come up. I think it's a really interesting question, right? Because, and Nick might have some thoughts or he might have seen some other work that does touch on this. Certainly Varian's work hasn't. But that kind of agency piece Nick was talking about and their kind of sophistication. I think in some ways, I don't know, young people in particular seem kind of profoundly disinterested in the product. And I think it could become a lever, but maybe not the primary one. So our most success has actually come from by removing some of those kind of sociability factors and allowing young people to see their addiction. Because at the end of the day, we want them to change their behaviors. So I would kind of wonder, if you focused on the industry too much, you kind of demonize them, but it might tend to be a misdirect or it would direct attention too much away from the actual personal behaviors that we're trying to address. But I'm keen to hear Nick's views as well.
Yeah, look, I haven't seen or heard anything specifically around the industry itself. One thing and you might want to touch on this too, Craig, one of the interesting things about the illicit space, so that we do here, is we have had discussions around, organised crime and those types of influences in that space. And there's a really interesting dynamic that goes on in terms of people's ability to deflect responsibility for participation in that space. So I think when you're engaging in the behaviour, there's this kind of perverse ability to sort of look the other way in some respect in that space. But in terms of big tobacco itself, it doesn't organically, as Craig said, seem to come up much in terms of the discussions that I see.
Yeah.
But the illicit space is an interesting one for me.
Yeah, I think illicits is super interesting because one big question we've been trying to tackle or answer is how or could we make a smoker kind of in the moment recognize that their purchasing choice is linked to crime. So there are some obvious issues for a smoker. So they often feel that regulatory pressures, so changes in excise, other things, I suppose, that they can blame the government for. So that tends to forefront. And this kind of builds on a point Laura's making consistently, which is it's the normalisation. So I think it could be tempting to think of illicit tobacco as really back alley, dodgy, always selling the lowest of the low, the worst of the worst. What we actually hear when we speak to product users, and we're not judging them, we're trying to understand, we're not making a moral judgment. They can buy high, medium, and low quality within the illicit market. But the purchasing environment, I think there was national news the other day about 100 plus petrol stations being raided, right? And what we've heard is, in fact, it's not just the availability, it's how it shows up and how that availability feels. So when you're standing in what looks like a normal brightly lit shop and lots of smokers perceive that the community around them turning a blind eye, everyone knows where the dodgy vape shops are, everyone knows that this is popping up, but no one's kind of doing anything about it. It creates kind of a sense of moral comfort or insulation for them. And in fact, and nothing in the product experience tells them that, no one is being stabbed. There is no signs of violence. There is no sign of a criminal overlord. So their ability to connect kind of those harm-based messages is really, really low. And they fundamentally come from a place of wanting to kind of deflect or ignore those messages, and or to say, okay, well, if it's a law and order problem, that is, the government has the classical tools of policing border control. That is a profoundly you problem, which again is similar, I think, maybe to if we were to start to position the tobacco industry. It's potentially a bit too distant. I mean, I'm not saying it's definitely a factor that drives the market, but I'm thinking more from a behaviour change lens.
Too far from citizen experience.
It's just maybe or saying, well, if industry is the problem, yeah, the one likely outcome would be deflection back to systems or government to say, okay, I'm just one smoker, my purchasing experience or whether I am funding industry is kind of moot. And I think, as Laura said, addiction is huge. Highly addictive, one of the most addictive substances. That also gets in the way of rational decision making or kind of taking in some of these rational messages that sometimes as government we are kind of tempted to go forward with.
Laura, I feel like you've got something to add there.
No, nothing significant to add. I think it's all I suppose, like, just reflecting on what's been said in the last little bit, I would never advocate for, campaigns around tobacco industry over and above kind of the health harms. I think they both need to happen at the same time. And from an advocacy perspective as well, the only way you're going to move the dial in terms of industry interference and industry presence and industry profits in this country is by softening the ground. And that's what I hear a lot with politicians. They'll constantly say, oh, I don't know, is that something that we should do? And I think, campaigns are a really big part of a comprehensive approach, but it shouldn't come at the cost of health harms and that kind of discussion as well. I suppose in an ideal world, I would be saying there should be a lot more money put into a lot more campaigns to stop those 66 deaths daily. And it should be a comprehensive approach on all respects. And I know that's such a boring term. It's just people roll their eyes at it, but it is genuinely the most effective way of tackling this industry and this addiction.
Speaking of addiction, I have a question that's come through on addiction. I'm going to read it straight out. We keep saying choice, but nicotine addiction isn't a choice. It's an attack on personal freedoms. It stops people getting ahead. And given the high annual cost of addiction, is this an angle for vapes that taps into that right-leaning ideological base? Should we be talking about addiction and what it's costing you? Nick, I might throw that at you.
Yeah, look, that's something that we've really have explored, and it's an really interesting one, the way young people approach that idea. There's this tension when you do start to unpick that, when we talk to them around how they perceive, I guess, their own agency. And so they do know inherently, they're very sophisticated, they've got good knowledge, they know that nicotine is addictive, but the idea of giving up the fact that it's a choice can be a bit of a barrier for a lot of young people. And so getting them across that line that I am addicted is one of those, I guess, challenging messages that we are looking to influence in the space at the moment, because it is one of the ones that when they do realize they're addicted, it's something that they want to sort of rail against, if you like, and say, well, that's affecting my locus of control over my own life, and I inherently want to have that control. So it's an opportunity area, I think, but it's getting there's almost a hump that we have to get people over to say, well, this is addictive. What was a pastime is now a habit, and making them understand that, or making them cross that line that says, I need to do something about this, is sort of one of those conclusion areas that we're trying to draw them along to make their own conclusion and then take action in that space.
And I guess it was a pretty massive watershed in the history of nicotine control and tobacco control too, right? Like convincing the general populace that nicotine was addictive and we all actually had a problem was a pretty epic hill to get over in the first place. So getting young people of any generation over that particular barrier is a pretty tricky one. Craig, how's that showing up in research?
Yes. So yeah, I think what we've seen is most successful, but what we know is that the marketplace changes and norms change. And I'll be clear, when we understand that once someone is addicted, like that takes away choice, but there's this whole other side, which is the perceived choices someone might have to kind of get into the category if they do, but also to get out of it. I think in a choice lens, with some of the work we've done, particularly for young people, and even how the campaigns are put together and what they say, rather than using the government voice to tell them you've lost all your choice, you've lost all your agency, you must quit. We've found a kind of gentler approach. So the first phases of the campaigns were really to kind of gently remind people that they've developed an addictive habit through kind of a social mechanism, but there's a social mechanism to get out, which would be quitting with your friends. And that was a key insight early on, is that there were lots of young people kind of secretly harboring, not big question, it was more latent, but kind of going, maybe vaping isn't maybe it's not the worst, but maybe it's not something I want to keep doing. So kind of elevating that was kind of point one. The more recent tactic has, rather than being to use the government voice to kind of say, you must quit now, it's kind of gently holding up a mirror about some of the consequences, so for a young person who might be now 21, 22, 23, who might have vaped since high school, they're starting to experience things. They've spent a fair bit of money probably on the habit and it's accumulated. The little cough that they probably didn't have as a 14-year-old boy or girl, their ability to run and chase a ball if they want to do social sports or run club. So it's holding up a mirror to those little moments. I think even visual cues. I think we show people what we call a vape graveyard. This is the collection of kind of, and again, just these gentle nudges of like, if you've got these many used vapes in your drawer, have a bit of a think about that. But it's not using that traditional kind of government voice to tell. It's much more of a showing strategy. And without harping too much on Nick's point, it's been really effective because I think it leans into that sense of agency that our key youth audience really values. So we're kind of not fighting them. We're kind of co-opting something that's important, and not in a manipulative way, but we're kind of using it against them a little bit, but quite successfully. So rather than an ad that tells them they have a problem, they watch an ad and they at the end kind of go, "Oh, I've decided I've got a problem," and that just feels completely different and kind of gives them the space to think about quitting in a different way.
Laura, we talked at the very start of the call, and I should say, if anyone else has got questions, please drop them in the Q&A. We would love your questions. Laura, we talked at the start of the call about, we have made a huge amount of progress and there are causes for optimism. What else makes you optimistic in this space, even as the landscape is changing so rapidly?
I would have to say what makes me optimistic is speaking to young people about kind of ending the tobacco industry. That makes me really optimistic. And I think moving forward from an advocacy perspective, I look forward to kind of bringing those voices in to those discussions more, because they're really powerful voices. And whenever I'm in workshops or roundtables or meetings and there's young people there, as they should be, discussing kind of well, Laura, that messaging is great, but you haven't asked me about that. And I could probably come up with something really bitey to do that. I love that. That really gives me a lot of optimism and hope. And young people don't want to be hooked on these things a lot of the time. And I think that that gives me a lot of optimism. And that's something that we're going to be trying really hard to incorporate into all of our work as well, because it's very powerful.
Yeah, us too. I think at Varian we're very passionate about seldom heard voices more broadly, but youth voices especially is a huge part of our practice and something we're really passionate about tapping into. Craig and I always laugh that we wouldn't get ethics approval, but if only we could drive teenagers around in the back of our car all day, you'd have the secrets to the universe because that's where they do all their talking. Nick, what gives you cause for optimism in this space?
Look, my glass is half full. My optimism is built around the fact that the norm is not to smoke, and increasingly it is such a minority behaviour. There are challenges in continuing to drive that lower and lower, but I think we're in the right direction. We're going in the right direction. We do have a range of levers. There are some challenges at the moment, obviously, and we've talked about a range of those at the moment. But we have a lot of opportunities to really engage with all of our audiences and speak to them and meet them and allow them to make decisions that are, I won't say correct, I will say correct, to make the right decision.
Thanks, Nick. Nick and Laura, thank you so much for joining us this morning. It's been fabulous to hear your insights and get some broader perspective on what's going on in the tobacco landscape. And thank you to all our attendees as well.
Thanks for having me.
Good morning.
Thanks for me too.
Bye-bye.